I'm Randy Rutta, President and CEO of the American Autoimmune Related Disease Association, and I'm pleased to kick off this Patient Advocacy Summit focusing on a very important issue to all persons with autoimmune disease, their families, and really our communities collectively, and that's the patient stake in autoimmune research, investment, and results. For so many people with autoimmune disease, it's a difficult journey, sometimes a too long journey toward getting a diagnosis of their particular autoimmune disease. Many people with autoimmune diseases have multiple conditions that they're grappling with, and research is the underpinning for not just diagnosing and understanding the characteristics of that disease, but also looking for cures and treatments that can ameliorate symptoms that really can be life-changing, or potentially even cures and other medicines and critical care that can be life-saving. And I'm pleased to have joining me today three expert speakers bringing different perspectives forward on how patients can better understand and be a part of that proactive research, investment, and results conversation. I'm pleased to have seated next to me Jeff Allen, President and CEO of the Friends of Cancer Research, an amazing leader in understanding the research community and how patients can be effective, particularly from the cancer community's experience. We have Jason Harris, who's the Director of Public Policy at the Lupus Foundation of America, an organization that really helps patients be strong advocates and actually invest significant resources in research themselves. And then seated next to Jason is Nancy Ginter, Director of Administration for the Beyond Celiac organization, a partner of AARDA's, and someone who can really bring forward that experience of collaborating with patients and understanding the research community, understanding why it's so important to really lobby for support in that space to start to bring drugs forward and other medications and care that would help people with celiac disease lead healthy and productive lives. So let me first turn to Jeff and just see what the experience has been of the cancer community, which I really think is a model for all of us to understand how to mobilize around research and then the benefits that come from it.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity to join you today. I think, no surprise in oncology, there's many groups, and I think what's been learned over the years is trying to decipher when to harness that power of partnership, when different groups can work together toward a common goal, versus when different groups need to focus on their different piece of the puzzle. And I think having the ability to distinguish between those activities can be particularly effective. And this has taken many years. I think there's, with a great deal of overlap at times in the oncology space, trying to figure out where different organizations can leverage their particular messaging and when to work with others in order to amplify it and make it more effective.
That's great. That's absolutely great. And Jason, why don't you talk to us a little bit about the lupus experience and research?
Yeah, absolutely. I think to Jeff's point, there's always going to be multiple organizations in a specific space. So understanding, when you can partner together or when you need to go down, some of your strategic organizational priorities is always important. From the LFA's perspective, we've, in terms of thinking about research, whether it's funding research or trying to leverage it from different areas, we have, on our side of what we try to fund is different grants or awards that will help young investigators or scientists who maybe they didn't get that NIH grant, but we want to be able to help bridge that gap so they can stay in our space because we want, the best and brightest. That's an example of something we do to try to continue to help those investigators on top of then pushing research, and being able to collaborate and understand, what some government agencies might be interested in and how can we help leverage and support that so that everything's sort of moving in the right direction. Stop there for now.
That's great. Nancy?
Well, thank you. And I represent Beyond Celiac, and I just want to give you a little background. We started our organization in 2003 as the National Foundation for Celiac Awareness. And that long name, hard to remember, said exactly what we did. We worked to raise awareness. And hopefully we have done a decent job about that. So as time went on, we have shifted our focus starting in 2016 when we changed our name to Beyond Celiac. And that, first of all, is easier to remember. And secondly, it really shows you a shift in what our focus is, which is on research. Of course, awareness will never go away. We'll always be doing that. But we now have a big focus on research. And this year in particular, we are very proud to be able to say that we have funded 3 substantial grants. One is being conducted by an immunologist, actually, who has started to work in the field of celiac disease, Paul Kletterman, in London, in England. And we have another grant that is going on at the Children's Hospital in Colorado, determining how children actually come to have celiac disease. And then Jocelyn Sylvester at Boston's Children's Hospital is also working on a grant that we have funded for the next 2 years. So that's our start, and I'm sure as we go along, I'll tell you more about what we're doing in the area of research.
But Nancy, that must have been, a strategic and maybe even a difficult decision on the part of the board, because resources are always scarce. There's many different priorities that you might look to invest those resources in. How did you talk to your board members? Were they the ones that thought that this was really a great place for this organization to be involved?
Well, first of all, the board really was enthusiastic about it, and I do believe that moving to research in its own way is a natural maturation path for a number of disease advocacy organizations. We had been engaged in research all along. We would partner with hospitals, with academic institutions, and even with individual researchers to do smaller scale research. Sometimes we did our own, I will call it research. They might even be just on the basis of a survey. So we have been working in that aspect in research for quite some time. But really it's the patients that made the difference, to tell you the truth. And I would have to say that patients are so eager to have this problem solved, to have the issue of celiac disease addressed, that they are, I would almost call it desperate to have research. And so they really are pushing organizations to help advocate for them to get this accomplished. Celiac disease, for those who don't know much about it, it's for all those who don't know about it, it's all those folks who eat gluten-free food, is a very isolating disease because people can't eat normally, so to speak, and their children can't if they have celiac disease. So there's a big push on the part of the patient.
Great, that's great. And I'm going to come back to you, Jeff, because I really do want that cancer community perspective. But I'm hearing what Nancy's saying, and it seems like that might be a little similar for the Lupus Foundation, where you really have made a priority not just to invest, again, scarce resources in important research, I think do a good job of involving patients, but then also really are an advocate for funding for NIH and for other government agencies. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a great education and research team that does a number of things that definitely want to get to later. However, we do have, we have our advocacy day where we'll bring lupus advocates and their families and people living with disease to DC, do the classic day of education, and we have our priorities. And within those, generally, as I think we've heard throughout some of today, but generally we'll always go in there and we'll want that NIH number to be as high as we can get it. Obviously, there are different agencies within NIH that focus on lupus, but right now we're focused on just getting that dollar amount with the patient community at large to the biggest number we can. And then we have some lupus-specific programs at the Department of Defense and one in the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that focus on different areas. So every year, since those programs have now been developed and are being implemented, that's going to be a focus priority for us from the lupus community perspective, because those dollars we want to leverage against obviously the great amount of money that our government puts into it. So being able to leverage those dollars for our community is always a big win. And we're always trying to capitalize on those types of issues as they pop up. We have these 2 programs, but if we can get more, it's certainly something we'll continue to foster.
So Jeff, when I said that I thought there was a lot that the autoimmune community could learn, obviously there are great things going on, but I just think about what happened in the cancer space, which seemed to be a massive mobilization of effort. And this was some years ago. I know a moonshot was kind of used to describe what kind of significant resources might need to be invested there. Talk a little bit about that. And I guess it had both a public component and did it have a private component where academic institutions and universities and healthcare providers and the pharma industry perhaps really got behind that call to action. Is that true?
Yeah, I think it's something that has probably been going on for many years. And in the field of oncology, of course, with the high prevalence of cancer generally, it's a topic which most people have some personal connection to. And I think at the outset, trying to leverage that direct personal experience has helped motivate people to either get involved with various organizations or begin to look at ways that they can influence policymakers or the health research system at large. But one thing that I've really seen change over the years in the oncology space was similar to the transition that you've mentioned, where perhaps several decades ago the focus was largely around raising awareness about a problem so that people knew that it existed and that something needed to happen. And then it shifted a little bit more toward demand, that just being aware of the problem was not enough, but demanding that there actually be change and solutions being sought after. And in the last few years, I think where we've really tried to focus on is where can advocacy organizations actually drive the solutions?
Right.
Not just be ones that are raising awareness of the problems and demanding that they be fixed, but really being the engine behind trying to figure out the actual solutions to take forward. And that's a different perspective and a unique vantage point that I think advocacy organizations contribute to the research process by being acutely involved in those discussions and making sure that their perspective is incorporated as heavily as the academic researchers, as the pharmaceutical industry, as policymakers struggle with some of these problems. I think it's a very valuable and unique vantage point that actually serves as a motivating force and makes sure that the right questions are actually being answered. I think it's hard when you think about designing things like a research study. If patients aren't involved in looking at what the questions are being asked in a research study, how can you expect them to want to participate in it? And I think the oncology community has spent several years trying to think through that and figure out ways that individual patients and their advocates can be more directly involved in all components of the research process.
So do you think there were some lessons learned through your community about patient engagement in that way that could really start early and then continue all the way on, maybe even past an individual's episode of treatment or care, so that they, as a cancer survivor, then may stay involved in this process? Have you seen a journey like that emerge?
Yeah, I think there's certainly been various forms of cancer that have strong, very powerfully motivated advocates that are willing to share their experience. And that's very telling for what needs to happen in the future. And I think that's an important component to think about ways that those individuals can be empowered and find the venues to be able to share their stories and communicate what their experience in research is, so that research can continually to be refined and incorporate that important patient perspective. But having some of those motivated individuals is really at the crux of the challenge. We've seen in some cancers, unfortunately, that haven't had the same progress that others have, that there are fewer people that are able to speak out about their successful experience and being treated with those particular forms of cancer. So I think those are the areas where we can leverage our partnerships and think about ways that we can adapt others' experiences in order to motivate the continued change in those fields that haven't seen the same type of progress.
Excellent. Have you seen receptivity on the part, because in the cancer community there are many organizations, they might be disease specific or have different areas of expertise or focus. Have you seen an understanding kind of emerge among them of the value of collaborating in that space, maybe having a consensus position, engaging patients collectively?
Yeah, like anything in society, there is competition, and that's always, I think a real thing. But it's really important to sort of focus on where your strengths are and carve out your niche. For our organization, we happen to focus on largely on policies and scientific priorities affecting the Food and Drug Administration. And the reason for that being was that several years ago we recognized that while having the engine of research and discovery being fully fueled through programs like the NIH, any new treatments that would be discovered either through public funding or through private investments, have to be funneled through the Food and Drug Administration. And without a strong, fully engaged and functioning participant and a partner that the FDA has become, in many ways in oncology too, has helped catalyze the development of new treatments in many areas. So I do think it's important for different organizations to know where they need to lead and know where they lead to follow. We're a relatively small organization. I certainly don't think we would be nearly as effective if we were focused on every component of the biomedical research enterprise. But by focusing our work on the FDA, I think we're able to contribute to a part of that process where a lot of other organizations historically have not focused.
Well, and we've talked about the FDA. There are certain parts of government that either are informally or increasingly more formally have structures that invite the patient in, or that patient's voice. And I think the FDA has proven, it's always probably room for improvement, but it's proven itself to embrace kind of early legislation that kind of made those requirements to really evolve a process that does create a space. And then it's incumbent upon patient groups like ours to help patients understand that that is an opportunity and maybe create a pathway to being effective. You know, Jason, I know the Lupus Foundation has really been a good partner to a lot of the federal agencies and others. Talk a little bit about what Jeff just shared and how that relates to your organization's experience.
Yeah, and I really appreciate what Jeff said. I actually wrote down one quote about how advocacy organizations can be the engine that drives those solutions. And I think from the FDA's perspective and through 21st Century Cures and the latest installment of PDUFA 6, the paradigm really shifted that has given advocacy organizations and patient advocacy groups that ability to be that engine. And it's been a really exciting space for the Lupus Foundation of America. 2 years ago, we actually held what they call an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. And from that meeting, we partnered with 2 other lupus organizations. But from that meeting, I think has allowed us now to look at that as the launch point for a number of initiatives we're going to have with the FDA, and making sure that the patient perspective and the lupus community's perspective is brought into a number of things about how they think about just getting drugs for lupus and designing trials and all those things. And I think we've all seen probably some acceptance on behalf of different stakeholders and our partners that now that feedback is not only wanted, but it's really needed for what's going to be approvals moving forward. So that work with the FDA is something we strongly focus on. It's really important. Even I think that it's not the wild, wild west, but there's so much that as these initiatives move forward with real world data and real world evidence that there's a lot of opportunity. And if we don't make sure that our perspective is in there, it's a missed opportunity.
Sure. Talk about the experience, whether it's in the oncology space or whether it's in the autoimmune space, for people who are out there leading their lives suddenly that's affected by some condition, be it cancer or be it an autoimmune disease. It seems like there are clinical trial information they should learn about, registries. Are those all entry points to supporting research, but on a very personal level? Maybe Nancy, you're nodding your head.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there are several things that we've been talking about that could stimulate a whole day's worth of conversation, I'm sure. But first of all, just to follow up on our advocacy aspect, we also have joined other alliances that are more focused on digestive disease, for example, and we work together to advocate for support for NIH and, in our case, NIDDK specifically. There's a Friends of NIDDK group, and we work with them. The same with the FDA has a group similar to that. So that is a good way for us to get out there and let them know what we need and back and forth. But in terms of what we do, we talk about clinical trials, we have truly become known, Beyond Celiac has become known as a group that can really engage patients to participate in clinical trials. On our website, we actually have a clinical trial finder, so people can come to our website and see what clinical trials there are in our field and then offer themselves as part of that trial. The other big thing that we're doing is a program we have called Go Beyond Celiac, and it's a patient database. People can come and go online, register, and tell their story, as you were discussing. They're led through surveys, several surveys, so that they don't have to think about it. They can just follow along. And in the end, they have told the story from the patient's point of view, which is so important for us to get across to researchers. In addition, anonymously, we have a lot of data that we can share with researchers, and that will help them learn what to focus on based on what the patient wants. We all know that doctors and researchers have their ideas of what's important, and the patients know what they need. And we, of course, are all for the patient's voice. Right. So this Go Beyond Celiac platform has been very helpful, and it will continue to be. It's very new, and we have 4,500, I should put it that way, registrants now, and it's growing. We also, and I can stop if you want me to stop now, but we do also have a research summit. We're going to have our second research summit coming up in November, as a matter of fact, and that summit brings together doctors, researchers, insurance companies, patients, caregivers, and the whole gamut. And their point of that is to work together to find ways to advance research and find new treatments, and of course, hopefully a cure, which is very important in our case because right now there is no pharmaceutical treatment, there is no cure, so we're really starting from the gluten-free diet, which is certainly not, as the saying goes, cutting it. It is not effective for everybody, and it's not effective for anybody all the time.
Sure.
So those are some thoughts, and I'm sure we'll come back to others.
Sure, well that's helpful. Jason, does that sound like a process that you might follow at Lupus or something comparable that would really bring some of those different stakeholders together, help them understand what resources are available, how to kind of direct them toward an effective path in advocacy?
Yeah, we don't have
their own health?
Yeah, we don't have a specific meeting. I really like that format that kind of brings together the researchers. I think we tried to use some of our advocacy summit to do that, but I mentioned this before, we have a great education and research team that educates and has a number of different programs or in-person events across the country about the clinical trial process, about what it's like having people who have been in them come and speak on a peer-to-peer basis, and just getting that education out in front. You can see the hunger of people who want to know more and want to participate. One other thing, as I mentioned earlier, we hosted an externally led Ph.D. meeting, and we sent 40 to 50 question survey out in advance and got thousands of responses completely full. And that to me, from what I've heard from some of my colleagues and my boss who was there at the time, that really showed the hunger of the community that filled all those out that quickly. Had a number of, everyone attended the FDDA, as many people as we could get in there were into the meeting. And so the community is really hungry, and it's about our organizations giving them the tools and the education to then let them make an informed choice on whether it be a clinical trial, but then also getting them into programs at the FDA like a patient rep program, things at the NIH similar, where it's kind of that next elevated status that the really hungry advocates, I would call them, can really engage.
Sure.
Being a patient representative is a very important thing. And Alice, I should talk about Alice Bast, who founded our organization in 2003, has certainly been very active, as you can imagine, in all of this, and she also is a patient representative for the FDA, which makes a big difference, because as is true with a lot of autoimmune diseases, not everybody knows what these diseases really mean and what the impact really is. And so this is a way of getting that word out to the people who can, in fact, take steps and make a difference. And we certainly worked a lot with the FDA when we were trying to get labeling for food, gluten-free food, so people actually would know what's in this product that they're buying. And it did take a while. It took a while to have just labeling of the major allergens, and then it took 6 more years to get people to get the FDA's approval for people to put that gluten was in this product on a voluntary basis. So we have worked together on that, and now we are moving ahead. We're trying to do the same thing for gluten in medicine. So for those who are interested, there's a bill out there that's been launched and it's in committee, HR 2074, that is for labeling to see if we can have it a regulation that there has to be gluten labeled on medicine as well.
Well, I think that's really helpful, and it's helpful to be that specific and having, seeing a way to move the system forward through legislation and then wrapping around that to really build a case for it. I know for the American Autoimmune Related Disease Association, we also, like the organizations here, do commit funds for research, and it's young researchers. It's not enough money necessarily for them to do a full lab, but it is an enticement to look at, making a career in this space. And I think from the board's perspective, the leadership's perspective, that's been very, very valuable. But each of you has mentioned, though, that researcher component. So does the patient, what role does the patient have in trying to create an environment for researchers, people that are going to work every day and may not have a discovery, but for once in a career sometimes? What can patients do to be supportive of and maybe help make sure that there is a researcher pipeline to really focus on oncology and new understanding that's there, or autoimmune disease, and certainly so much discovery that's yet to occur?
On an individual basis, it's really important to even just start with having these discussions, and have the discussions very early on, maybe even out of context in terms of participating in a clinical trial. To be clear, participating in a clinical trial can be burdensome. It can be time-consuming. And for an individual who is sick and scared, that may not be something that rises to the top of the list of things that they should be talking to their doctors about. But to be able to have those discussions early so that perhaps it is top of mind, I think is really important. I think these are the people that are truly the heroes of research. And I'm really proud of family members of mine that have participated in clinical trials, and they did so because they thought that it gave them a channel to have access to very high quality care. And I think that's an important component that clinical trials can play, but also to embrace what they were dealing with in a way of trying to help those in the future that would have to deal with that. And I can only imagine how difficult that was for them or for any other patient who's considering clinical trials as part of their care. But I think those are two highly motivating factors for individuals to think about and to have those discussions. And that can lead to the future of stimulating some of the research that needs to happen. And I think sort of embracing those goals of providing access to high quality care and solving problems for the generations to come are what organizations like ours should be focused on. And in terms of funding research and encouraging research, it's trying to look at ways of doing things differently is where we focused all of our research programs on. Obviously, cancer is a comparatively very well-funded disease area, and that's led to truly transformational progress for many types of cancers, but there's of course much more to be done. So what we focused on is how can we do things differently, not just add to the pot of research funding. While I believe that's certainly an important foundational element, what our organizations can do is try to leverage things that are happening in different silos and serve as the motivating factor to break down those silos and think about ways that we can bring different stakeholders together to change the process and make things more focused on delivering the new therapies for patients that otherwise don't have them. And that type of urgency is something, as a former research, you can lose focus on when you're going to your lab day after day and trying to solve the mysteries of what goes on within a cell and how that contributes to a biological process. And of course, during all of that, the patient is still in the back of your mind, but to be able to leverage that motivating factor and keep people focused on a common goal, I think is a real powerful thing that our organizations can contribute.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing that. I mean, I know your background and knew that you had exactly that experience. I didn't know about your family members, and congratulations to them, and thank you for being a part of this process. You really do have insights when you think about, those researchers going into their labs in clinical settings, and which can be so isolated in so many ways, and yet they are interacting with patients. So anything we can do to really amplify that and thank them. I know there have been different ways organizations or even industries have thanked those researchers for that commitment, that lifelong commitment. So thank you for what you've done in that space and now currently carrying on. You know, I was talking to one of our audience members earlier who said herself she's participating, did you say at NIH? Does this resonate with you in terms of what Jeff was just sharing?
Oh yeah, the clinicians and all the researchers that work at NIH are really pretty much 100% partners with their patients, because they're really paving the way for future hopes of a cure or a treatment option. These patients are really brave to go through some of these rigorous testing and clinical trials, and the clinicians really appreciate their willingness to partner with them. And it's a really amazing place to be involved as a patient and as just a patient advocate as well. So it's really, all those things really hit close to home.
I'm just hearing from your tone that those patients are respected. It's understood by people in the NIH setting that it's not easy to have someone who might be coming from a great distance and not feeling very well to be there. So you see that respect and appreciation. That's great.
Especially when, you know, NIH is the #1 research institute in the world, and people literally come from all around the world to be a part of this research. It's really amazing.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. You know, I think about purple capes. Why do I say that? Because I know I was up on Capitol Hill when there were literally, it felt like thousands of people wearing purple capes who were representing the lupus world, the National Lupus Foundation of America, and the work they were doing. This was part of their message. How did they talk about this issue? I mean, they were talking about appropriations probably and priorities within research. Talk a little bit, Jason, about how patients who are going to be listening to this presentation understand where their place might be and how they might come to wear a purple cape or some other way be a part of another organization's movement on this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, in that instance, you know, for our summit, last year we had close to 300 people, a little bit more. So glad to hear it seemed like the thousands.
It did.
But the idea behind that was, yeah, we had what we called our Looper heroes, so lupus heroes in capes. And initially, 2 years ago, it was actually, we have a kids congress that runs with our summit, and it was really for the kids. And then it kind of took off that we said, no, let's do it. Let's blow it up for the whole summit next year. And so, you know, in this instance, these advocates, you know, they came to Washington, D.C., they wanted to do this, and so we went up to the Hill. Again, we had our priority asks, and, you know, as a part of the conversation, we have our the classic, I'll call it 5-5-5, where you have about 15 minutes usually for a meeting, so 5 minutes introduction, 5 minutes for the story, 5 minutes for your ask. So it's a nice introduction too. With the capes, it kind of, you know, makes everything a little bit easier as a quick laugh, and then it allows you to know, hey, purple, lupus, it's definitely helped with the Hill. I've heard from some friends too who told me just earlier, like, hey, was that you guys in the purple capes? And I was like, yeah, and then obviously,
Yep.
you know, Randy.
Nothing like
of course.
branding.
That's right.
Exactly. So I got to give a big shout out to our marketing and comms team.
Yeah,
They did
great.
fantastic there. But in terms of what those programs were, we had our 3 specific lupus programs and then NIH. So those 4 asks. So on the Monday before the Tuesday, which is when we go to the Hill, we have education about those topics. We always, you know, say, you know, none of us need to be experts on, you know, the exact details of what's going to go into this grant for CDC. The important thing is make sure that we bring this disease and put it in front of, you know, your story, in front of the face of members, and really, most importantly, their staff. And so by doing that and having these programs, then they have the follow-up capabilities with either you know, my team or you know, anyone else that's able to get them that info. And it's a really powerful day too. You know, you have people come back from the Hill to a reception area,
Yes.
and everyone is buzzing around talking about, you know, who they met or what kind of meeting they had. And then, you know, the really key thing too is that, so you do that once, it's maintaining that relationship throughout the year, going to district meetings in August when folks go home, making sure, you know, you can bring your purple cape again and make sure they don't forget you, but also just via email with the staff. Hey, you know, thanks for I saw you sign this Dear Colleague letter that's supporting the appropriations. We really appreciate that. And, you know, if they didn't, say, hey, you know, we're going to be back next year and we're going to make the case again. So that's a little bit.
That's great. And are there resources? I mean, you describe sounds like a pretty robust process, one that you've been evolving, you know, as part of this presentation. I'd love to share some of those ideas and research. Do you have things like that
Absolutely,
that the
yeah,
LFA could share?
Definitely.
Terrific, terrific.
More capes.
Well, it was impressive, let me tell you.
I bet. I can imagine.
That's right.
It sounds like a great site.
Well, it was great. Any other questions from our audience members about this issue? I know it's an important one to all of us.
I think one of the important things I've always found is, you know, docs often get stuck with patients and not sure, and trying to remember that the NIH or other folks are around to make a suggestion, you know, is always a good one. I mean, I'm only 100 miles away, but, you know, I'd say to patients, you know, you can go to the NIH and see world-class docs, and then go shopping and eat in Washington afterwards. What's the downside? You know,
So you're saying a
there's-
research community of experts who could be partners.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's, a lot of people just don't think about, they don't think about clinicaltrials.gov rather, you know, as an opportunity to learn more just about anything.
Sure.
And I think that's something for all of us to keep pushing.
But
thank you.
If I might, it's very important to have the patients talking to these folks. And we, of course, join in with advocacy experiences on the Hill and groups of patients going and telling their stories, and including children. It gets a lot of attention. Children, as you probably had the experience, gets a lot of attention. And it's so important to have people be engaged. So part of the goal, my individual thoughts, but I'm sure everyone else's, is to take people who are, when they first hear about that diagnosis, it's like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do now? They have no idea. A lot of times they get a diagnosis and someone says, well, you have celiac disease, almost goodbye and good luck, you know, and so then that's when the journey really begins. And I think through all of what we all do, we can turn fear and depression and worry into hope. And I think that the more people know about what their power is, if they can tell their story and they can be heard, it makes a huge, huge difference. And the same thing is true with getting the word out about research. We have a research newsletter that goes out once a month to our constituency, and that's 140,000 people at a crack that are getting information in a newsletter about what the current research is. We have, every year, we have a research symposium, and it's live streamed. And people, the last one, there was over 2,000 people who listened in. There was a live audience and who listened in. And I think just the more that people hear about research, the more hope they can have. We also have on our website, I'll just tell one more thing, on our website we have something called Voice and Visions. And it's a series of very short, like 6 minutes long, interview, or it's a researcher speaking to the camera about what they're doing in the field of celiac disease and how they're processing their research and what their goal, what their hoped for goal is. And I just think the more you can put out there, the better off you are in terms of having familiarity, and it can reduce the scariness of it, and it can see a future.
That's great. And it sounds, I would also say, as I did for LFA, there could be resources and things that we would want to associate with this presentation that could be really instructive to patients, even in other areas of autoimmune disease, who could learn from what you're doing and maybe encourage their organizations to do something similar. I'm curious just a little bit, and then I'm going to want you just to give kind of a call to action. If you could put one thing out there for the patient community, and Jeff, you know, thinking about what you're doing with Friends of Cancer Research. But before I do, I just want to ask, we're talking a lot about a federal level advocacy, because that is where NIH and a lot of these big decisions are being made by federal agencies. Is there, one, a role for state government? And is there also a place for advocacy that might affect family foundations or philanthropists or others who I know have been, well, certainly in the cancer community, pretty powerful forces in moving things forward, and then similarly with autoimmune disease? Any thoughts about that?
Our organization does focus solely on federal programs for the most part. There are many state issues that perhaps are growing and becoming even more exacerbated than some of the challenges we see on the federal level in some instances. that's just an area that we've found is best for us to follow and support our colleagues,
Okay.
As opposed to trying to invest in creating programs that could be redundant to good things that are going on by others. I think with disease-oriented philanthropic foundations, in many cases, they often get started to fill a void that they experienced. And I think that's a very important and productive activity, but it goes back to also trying to leverage the collaboration that can occur and to try and work with seemingly disparate organizations around common goals, developing best practices, leveraging each other's activities with the goal of creating a synergistic effect where the sum is greater than the individual parts. And I think that can be difficult to do, but there's a real opportunity in terms of trying to leverage things that other people have learned before you, as opposed to having everyone forced to being a trailblazer all their own.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you don't want those resources being expended in a vacuum, certainly, and then not be amplified in other areas of research, either just because of its information sharing or kind of synergistic kind of work that could be done. Jason, what are your thoughts on that? And just kind of a call to action to the patient community, maybe even beyond lupus, but building on what lupus has seen in this space.
Absolutely. I kind of want to take a little bit of what Jeff said again. For example, in lupus, we want to be able to learn from things that Jeff's group has done, whether that's innovative clinical trial design that's specific to a certain endpoint in cancer. What are the nuts and bolts around that where we can learn from that? Because we don't want to have to redesign a number of different things that we have a lot of great work going on across the community from different advocacy groups, but it's sort of trying to find that minimum standard of, okay, what works across the board so we don't have to think about this when we're trying to design our registry. So learning from others is huge in that respect. I would love to get a huge philanthropic donor who's connected to lupus. So
Well, put it out there, that's right.
We're still looking for you.
That's right.
And I think for other patient advocacy organizations, the easiest thing, I think that sometimes can be the scariest too with respect to communicating with the Hill or any government agency is just reach out. Just do it. Even if it's a general email, whatever it is, reach out, people will respond back, and then you get going. A lot of times it's that, how do I get started? And I think, wherever you are and what level you're at, it's just get started and you'll figure it out.
Well, thank you for that. Nancy, any last thoughts on?
Getting started is always a good idea.
Right.
I can tell you that. So I should first of all give some credit to we have a chief scientific officer and a scientific advisory council that is made up of true experts in this field, and they of course guide us on what path we should take in terms of what we want to do. But in terms of how we move ahead, as you say, we'd love to have that philanthropic rainfall come our way. But actually, a very good tool is plain old grassroots fundraising, because that does two things. First of all, of course, it helps raise money. And who knows, in that grassroots fundraising pool is that person who really may be the philanthropist that you're looking for. But more importantly, in its own way, is that it engages people and they feel a part of things.
Right.
They are taking action, they're moving ahead, they're part of the deal, they're part of the action, they're part of the solution. So I think that the grassroots fundraising approach that's for us has been very rewarding. And again, it's all part of the moving forward, hopeful part of life. I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, you absolutely did, and I think it speaks to what Jeff said about patient engagement and recognizing that someone's health and certainly the path forward with treatments and research is a place where you want not to be done to, but to be a part of. And I think you're each describing that. Well, thank you so much. I mean, I think having your expertise, Jeff, Jason, Nancy, on this important topic. I mean, when you think about the patient stake in research, both investment and then the results that come from it, and it's sometimes a wandering path sometimes because research doesn't always lead to that best conclusion that first time, but it's a learning process which patients have to be involved in because the stakes are high. I mean, it literally is a matter of life and death, and or quality of life versus compromised health and well-being. And so for patients to be engaged, I think is critically important. AARDA is certainly excited to be a part of that support network and funding research and going forward. And for each of you, thank you so much for your leadership, for the resources that we can share, and know that we'll all work together in getting to the right place. So thank you so much.
Well, we think